Okay, we're talking about C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. Because students are reading it, and they're doing a discussion board assignment too.
Okay.
So they've got to read it, and then their assignment is to in the discussion board say one thing that they appreciated or whatever, and then they'll comment on each
Okay.
other. So,
Cool.
I think this is the first time I've tried that for the undergrad class. So
Okay,
I'm
great.
excited about seeing how that goes.
Cool.
So let's talk a little bit about like what this book is in connection with the other works. So
Mhm.
it's a space trilogy
Mhm.
with 3 books.
Right.
Out of the Silent Planet is first, this Perelandra the second, and then That Hideous Strength.
Mhm.
Do you have a favorite of those?
Perelandra is probably my favorite
Okay.
of those. It has been a while since I've read it, but when I read these, that one was the stood out to me the most, primarily for those last couple of chapters. They're just really beautiful.
That's the same thing that I thought. I
Yeah.
thought that you assigned That Hideous Strength for your class.
I did, because I thought there was more for that class. That was a better culminating text, I think, for all the things that we had read in world literature.
Okay.
But I love Perelandra a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like both Perelandra and That
Mhm.
Hideous Strength. The first time I read it was in college. I read Perelandra first, and then I read That Hideous Strength, and just I never read anything like it before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, I hadn't read a whole lot of books at that point. I needed to take in your class, but it was one of the first actual like works of fiction
Mm-hmm.
that I'd read in a long time, and it just drew me in, and I appreciated it. Appreciated the symbolism, and appreciated just what he was saying about reality.
Mm-hmm.
being
Yeah.
different. So I thought we should just quick summary of what. This just keeps going back each time. So Out of the Silent Planet, that's where, in the beginning, Weston, who we meet in Perelandra, kidnaps Ransom and takes him to Mars. He does that because he thinks he needs to offer him as a human sacrifice. Turns out he's mistaken in that.
Right.
But in the process, Ransom learns the old solar language,
Mm-hmm.
and he's exposed to this whole idea that there's these, well, I don't like to say angelic, but that's one other topic, but these beings, superhuman
Mm-hmm.
beings that are over these realms, and he's exposed to all that, interacts with them, and then comes back to our world. And then he knows Old Solar, which is why he is picked to then go to Perelandra for the adventure that he has there. So, and then so the first one is on Mars, the second one is on Venus, and then the third is on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe without giving too many spoilers for those who haven't read it, like what happens in That Hideous Strength?
So That Hideous Strength is focused on Earth. It's sort of like a dystopian fiction almost, and it's like there's this organization that is attempting to essentially take over the world. Basically, that's the long-term plot, I suppose. They're very technologically oriented, and very the idea is to sanitize the planet of all. Basically, ultimately, as the characters get deeper into that organization, they realize it's like the goal is to basically eliminate life, because sort of like the worldview they have is antithetical to thriving and living, right? So then the Eldils, those superhuman characters, come and interact with Ransom and his little band of, sort of like the last standards for truth kind of a thing to destroy the organization, which the acronym for it is the NICE. They're the nice organization. They're trying to be, they're have the whole propaganda campaign and everything to get the whole, little countryside towns behind them and everything. So they that's the struggle and the sort of conflict, I guess.
Yeah, that one's great. Because that one's great too, because it doesn't focus. I like the way it doesn't focus on ransom, but it begins it begins and ends with a marriage, like tying in the utterly ordinary with this crazy, extraordinary, major world universe conflict is tied in to the very ordinary events of a marriage, and in such a way that is presented as one thing. It's the same conflict going on in that marriage in the thing.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
that's pretty cool the way he does that. So what is it about? Why does he choose fantasy to communicate these things?
Yeah.
Like how is it different because it's fantasy than? And I even think so. That Hideous Strength has a book that goes along with it, The Abolition of Man. I don't know if you read that one.
Yeah.
And I remember reading Abolition of Man and being like, wow, this is really insightful. I hardly remember anything about it. I remember reading That Hideous Strength being really insightful, and yet I can recall those things about it. So there's something about the fact that he's put it with a story that certainly helps us out a lot of it. But so the way he uses nonfiction, but then also the way he uses fantasy to do this.
Yeah. I think I was trying to find a quote from him that I like. I don't think I pulled it up, but he talks about fiction being able to sort of like grasp and catch something that is fleeting and beautiful, and he uses the metaphor of catching a bird, and it's like you can catch the bird and eventually it's going to fly away and be gone again, but for a second you have it, and fantasy and fiction for Lewis is like the thing that allows you to catch these big heady ideas that are just big, and fleeting, and you get these little glimpses and glimmers of truth, and so that's his way to like capture them a little bit for a moment. But I like that you brought up Abolition of Man and that going along with That Hideous Strength. It's always interesting to me when authors do that. One of my other favorite pairings is Chesterton's Orthodoxy, which he wrote like a year either before or after he wrote The Man Who Was Thursday, which is a fiction text. Orthodoxy is essays. Yeah. But if you read them together, you can see the themes going very, very parallel. It's like there's something in fiction that allows us to work out ideas, and they're both legitimate formats for expressing ideas and expressing truth. Like you can do it in the very essay formulaic, way. And neither Lewis or Chesterton, when they write essays, sound very formulaic. They're great writers.
It's not like when I
either
write
way, right. But their fiction captures a whole other experiential side where it is embodying those ideas in ways that's really interesting. There's this whole idea that's really an educational theory idea that I've been getting interested in recently, but this idea of like embodying types, and examples to teach. And I think there's something Christ did in parables, right? Those aren't fantastical, really.
Right.
But there's the Abraham and Lazarus one, that expands heaven and hell, and it crosses those realms other than just earthly, and they it's a way to embody a truth and show it to you instead of expositorily explain it, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He's really good at that, I guess.
And you brought up scripture, and we obviously we're not in any way saying that it's fiction, but yet it isn't.
But they're stories.
They're stories.
They're stories.
Yeah, they're stories. They're real stories, but they're stories. And God's using the storied aspect of human history in order to reveal truth. And at the end of the day, story is more real because that's what we're in. Like we're in a giant story.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
Especially the way the Space Trilogy puts it, this ends up being, when you get to the last book, this is our story. So even though it starts off with this, very fantastical and just strange, he's making very real points all the way through. But at the end, he's saying something very clear about what our life is really all about. As he does, tieing marriage and this final cosmic cataclysmic battle. So with and I want to say that when I say that, I think of the animals in that battle.
Yes,
It's just
yes.
this like, and then the bear, which
Yeah.
is just,
Right.
it's just great.
Right.
It's just great.
Yes.
So. Hmm. Well, so one of the things that I thought might trip up some of the students, which, I had to think about it, and I recently read Perelandra to some of my kids, so we kind of walked through a lot of these things, is the issue of when he talks about the gods. So your page numbers are different than mine, but so this is where he has just gone through that long tunnel towards the end, after he kills Weston and then kills him again, and then he sees the various things in this just massive halls underground, and then he says, and it appeared to Ransom that there might, if a man could find it, be some way to renew the old pagan practice of propitiating the local gods of unknown places in such a fashion that it was no offense to the god himself, but only a prudent and courteous apology for trespassing. And I think that idea comes out again and again in both this and in that hideous strength. But just that fact that he'll talk about the gods. He calls the woman a goddess of some sort here. So how is that not like idolatry that he's dabbling with?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful or good to remember that Lewis was a scholar of myth and story. So his bread and butter was mythologies, right? So he's using that kind of the vocabulary of that field of study and the ideas of that field of study a lot, and that shapes his own fiction. And one of the things that was a stumbling block or a blockade to Lewis converting to Christianity for a long time was that when you examine all those old myths and all those old stories, you see story cycles repeated again and again, and the sort of overarching narrative of ideal man who saves a fallen place, often by dying, and then redeems it or restores order, is all over ancient mythology. And so for a long time he was like, well, the Christian story is just another iteration of this myth, right? And he writes about how his own conversion was when he realized that Christ is a historical person. Like, it is another iteration of that story that actually happened. And therefore it's like a fulfillment of all this ancient longing for that. The ancient world in all those stories is longing for Christ. They just don't know they're longing for Christ. That's what they're longing for when they long for a hero and someone who can restore order to brokenness, and and even the restorations that are articulated in those little ancient myths are pitiful compared to actual restoration, right? But that's as close as the ancient world can get, right? It's as close as they can get to short of revelation of scripture. They don't, they can't get any further than that. And I think that is an important idea that Lewis writes about and shaped him and Tolkien as well, and they were very much in conversation with each other. And I think that he is really willing to recognize in the ancient world the longing for and recognition of truth, even if they don't quite know what it is, right? That the ancient conceptions of the divine were wrong, not correct, but they were longing for the divine. They were groping in the dark for something. And so I think sometimes I think maybe that's part of what he's doing when he's naming planets. He's using Mars and Venus and all that sort of thing. It's like he's gesturing back to these old stories that for him are very important, and recognizing that there's a little glimmer of truth in there, and it totally, the superhuman creatures in these stories, the Eldils, like in that Hate of Strength, when they come to Earth, it's like shattering, like they're incredible and majestic and wild, and Ransom says they're like not even close to the glory of God, and so the idea is like, maybe a piece of the idea is that those human conceptions that are not scripture and fall short of scripture still get at a little bit of truth and give you a little glimmer of something. And so he's like honoring that little glimmer of truth, maybe. But the quote you read is interesting, because it seems like he's struggling a little bit with that in what you read, where he's saying, is it even possible to do that and not offend God, right? So I think he's not he's conscious of that problem, or that tension.
Of that field. It reminds me of what one author who writes about the theology of other religions. He wrote a book called "Their Rock Is Not Our Rock," and he picks it up from somebody else. It's not his phrase, but he uses the phrase of subversive fulfillment is the posture that Christianity takes towards the other religions. So it subverts it as well as fulfills it. So it fulfills that longing, at the same time subverts that longing at the same time. So it's too simplistic to try to say, is that true or false? It's like, well, it's not utterly false. If any worldview was utterly false, no one in the right mind would ever believe it. There's always some truth in there. There's always a little bit of truth. But yet that truth is tied to error at its core. So there's this subversive fulfillment. It fulfills the longing that was expressed in the gods, and yet subverts that in a way that, like you said, this is not even close to the glory of God.
For sure.
Yeah, well, that's helpful. So the students shouldn't think that they're reading something that is promoting idolatry.
Right, I don't think so. I don't think that's what Lewis is about at all. I think if anything, those figures should be seen. They are characters and they are superhuman in the story, but they're also highly symbolic, and I think they are embodiments of and symbols of myth, the myths that they dealt with, right? They're, so they sort of represent that understanding of truth that just falls so short, and you look at like the ancient Greek and Roman, panoply of gods and all their mythologies and everything, like it just falls so short of scripture, but and so that divide is huge. It's like the divide between the Eldils and God that Ransom talks about, that divide is huge. So I think he's symbolizing and trying to embody that a little bit, I think.
Well, speaking of that divide, what about the divide between humans and the Eldil? Or the Eldil are, I use the word angels, but I kind of don't like to do that because I can't remember a time where he actually uses the word angel in here.
No, I don't think he does.
I don't think he does. Yet he uses the word Christ to talk about Meladil, who's so he doesn't. So he's willing to say, okay, let me bring in the real truth and sort of have this creative, sanctified imagination in terms of how this relates. That was a phrase I was going to use related to the fantasy. What is it? Like sanctified imagination, where it's kind of fun. But so with the sanctified imagination, he's bringing in biblical truth, mixing it with this imaginative world, saying, "What if?" Which is, kind of what he's doing with the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, with Chronicles of Narnia. But that's like entirely in that world. This is this sort of bridging thing. And so he's relating this imaginative world to the real spiritual reality that we find in Scripture. And he's using the words to overlap, but he never uses the angels. He never uses the word angels in here.
That's
perhaps maybe because angels have been so co-opted by this lesser reality of what they are, that word angel, that he wants to just say, let's not even go just there at all.
Reimagine entirely,
And I was reading it, when I was reading it to my kids, they were like, wait a minute, what is this? And I said, well, they're angels. And then I think my wife wisely said, well, I think he's saying instead that when you think of angels, you should think of them more like this.
Right. They're not like flying around with wings and harps,
Yeah.
right? Like they're
Yeah.
these like incredible creatures that if you were in the same room with one would be almost like dangerously, you know,
Right.
majestic.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's a passage, and this is just, just goes on. His writing is so good too. But he says, I was just preparing to rise again and hunt systematically around the room for a candle. This is when he goes into the room and he bumps into this casket, and he's not sure what's going on, has a spiritual conflict to kind of get there at the very beginning.
Right.
And he says, so I was going to hunt again systematically around the room for a candle. When I heard Ransom's name pronounced, and almost, but not quite simultaneously, I saw the thing that I had feared so long to see. I heard Ransom's name pronounced, but I should not like to say I heard a voice pronounce it. The sound was quite astonishingly unlike a voice. It was perfectly articulate. It was even, I suppose, rather beautiful. But it was, if you understand me, inorganic. We feel the difference between animal voices, including those of the human animal, and all other noises pretty clearly. I fancy, though it is hard to define. Blood and lungs and the warm, moist cavity of the mouth are somehow indicated in every voice, but they were not. But here they were not. The two syllables sounded more as if they were played on an instrument than if they were spoken. And yet they did not sound mechanical either. A machine is something we make out of natural materials. This was more as if rock or crystal or light had spoken itself. And it went through me from chest to groin like the thrill that goes through you when you think you have lost hold while climbing a cliff. And then he goes on and on to talk about how that's what he says, that's what I heard. What I saw was this very faint rod or pillar of light. Sorry about that. A reminder to turn off your phones in class. And then he goes on and he talks about how it wasn't so much that these things were inhabiting this world, but our world was somehow like summoned up into their world, and they were the more real than anything else he was seeing. He says, he goes on and talks about how he can't explain it. How is it possible to have a visual experience which immediately and ever after becomes impossible to remember? I do not attempt to explain. It just goes on, this majesty, this amazing thing of these spiritual beings, and that they're real, and that we should think of them, in this way.
Right, yeah.
Contrasting then with the glory of humanity.
Yeah, sure. I can't remember where, probably a professor in college at some point, but just used to talk about in a piece of literature, like, what is the really real? That is where the heart of the story, the author is, what they're trying to communicate, or whatever. And he's crafting them as more real somehow than us,
Right.
Which is maybe where that fantastical element is helpful, because if everything in the story is us, then we are the really real, and so we're the focus, but if you can transcend that and say, no, there's something else that is more really real even than us, and he's just imagining these Eldils, and they're pointing you to God beyond that, even in his framework. So that's where maybe that fantastic element helps as well.
Yeah, that's true. And as we think about it, though, we are reminded that this is the world in which we live. There really are that spiritual battle that Paul writes about and says what we're waging against is very real. And as we live in this world, and we see our bodies, and that's all there is in our immediate experience, according to what we see, it's so easy to forget that this other spiritual reality is there and is very much a part of our world. And he gets at that a little bit in the beginning, where he's like terrified to walk to the house, and then he's like, "Why am I so afraid of this?" And then it turns out that there was Eldil that were invisibly trying to prevent his journey.
Yeah, and that's more real than what he can actually see and perceive with his senses, right?
Suggesting to us, I guess, who knows what is really going on,
Mhm.
like in our world,
Mhm.
and the
Sure.
temptations that we face.
Yeah.
What spiritual realities may have
Mhm.
been
Mhm.
in and through and behind that
Yeah.
that we don't
Yeah.
know? What have we been spared from because of
Mhm.
these spiritual
Mhm.
realities
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we do not?
We just had no idea about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I love the part at the end where he sees both the man and the woman in their glorified state, and then he sees the Eldil
Mhm.
as well, and he's
Mhm.
just like, these are two different kinds
Mhm.
of glory.
Mhm.
Reminding me of the 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul talks about each body has a certain kind of
Mhm.
glory, and
Mhm.
he's like, this is amazing, this
Yeah.
inorganic, not part of this world glory, and then here's this man and the woman, and they're part of this world.
Mhm.
They're flesh,
Yeah.
and there's blood, and there's their
Yeah.
bodies,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how they interface with
Mhm.
the spiritual realm.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's at the end. I guess one of your favorite.
Right.
You said you
Yeah.
like the last couple
Yeah,
chapters.
yeah. Well, I wouldn't spoil it for your students, but the metaphor.
Theoretically,
of
they
the,
should have been
oh,
pretty
they
much
should have
finished.
read
They
this.
should
Okay.
they should be doing this over the next few weeks. So
Okay.
yeah, they should be pretty far along. Should emphasize
Yeah.
there. Here is the.
Should. Right. No, when they're all, yeah, this is it. It's a long passage, but when they're talking about the great dance, and all of the universe's parts moving in this choreographed dance.
Yeah. If you read a section there,
yeah, let's see.
Just to tie it into the actual language that he uses will be helpful for the students.
Right. So I think this is towards the beginning. I think it's one of the or maybe several of the Eldils who are saying it, right? He says, the great dance does not wait to be perfect until the peoples of the low worlds are gathered into it. We speak not of when it will begin, it has begun from before always. There was no time when we did not rejoice before his face as now. The dance which we dance is at the center, and for the dance all things were made, blessed be he. Another said, never did he make two things the same, never did he utter one word twice. After earths, not better earths, but beasts. After beasts, not better beasts, but spirits. After a falling, not a recovery, but a new creation. Out of a new creation, not a third, but the mode of change itself is changed forever. Blessed is he. And it just keeps going on with different perspectives and examples, but that idea that the dance is at the center is a really lovely way to articulate that. I think that everything is moving according to this choreography that is, again, part of that we can't see that. We can't see the great dance. We're in it and part of it and don't even realize it, but the Eldils are able to have that perspective, and see how all things are just basically it's just under God's sovereign control, right? That's what they're talking about, but it's just really beautiful. I love that ending passage. It's lovely.
Yeah. The whole theme that you don't have anything come back, he never does the same thing twice.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And also how he wrestles with finding himself in that grand story, knowing that it's headed in a good direction and it all is all good. And yet, and this gets into theodicy, the problem of evil, which we'll talk about in this class too. That yet the fall was bad. Like, one of the things that that Weston tries to say yes, you should go stay on that fixed island is, well, when the Queen Mother in your world, Ransom, when she disobeyed, it turned out really good.
Yeah.
And like, well, okay, yes, God used it for good, but it was bad and something was lost.
Yeah.
And so I think he brings that together really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and something in there. He said after a fall. Let's see if I can see it. After a falling, not a recovery, but a new creation.
Yeah.
Right, like the fall happened, right, and new creation is what we're looking forward to, right?
Right.
So. Yeah, it doesn't just go back to the way it was, right? It goes back, or it goes to something new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that there's a good in Perelandra, Venus, not having fallen.
Yeah.
but being just immediately taken into that goodness. There's a
Mhm.
good there, and
Right.
he's so
Right.
glad that he can witness that good
Yeah.
apart from the fall. And he's saying, yes,
Right.
in that new creation, in earth, it will be good, but it won't have been this. And this
Right.
is another good
Right.
that we missed.
Right.
But we have this good,
Right.
and so
Right. Yeah.
which gets at, I think, the whole thing about the way the woman thinks of the whole idea of the wave that Meladale has given you. So here, here is Ransom and the woman talking. Oh, said the lady. She turned aside with her head bowed and her hands clasped in an intensity of thought. She looked up and said, "You make me grow older more quickly than I can bear," and walked a little further off. Ransom wondered what he had done. It suddenly bore in upon him that her purity and peace were not, as they had seemed, things settled and inevitable like the purity and peace of an animal, that they were alive and therefore breakable, of balance maintained by mind, and therefore, at least in theory, able to be lost. There was no reason why a man on a smooth road should lose his balance on a bicycle, but he could. There was no reason why he should step out. There was no reason why she should step out of her happiness into the psychology of our own race, but neither was there any wall between to prevent her doing so. The sense of precariousness terrified him, but when she looked at him again, he changed that word to adventure, and then all words died out of his mind. Once more he could not look steadily at her. He knew now what the old painters were trying to represent when they invented the halo. Gaiety and gravity together, a splendor as of martyrdom, yet with no pain at all, seemed to pour from her countenance. When she spoke, her words were a disappointment. I have been so young till this moment, that all my life now seems to have been a kind of sleep. I have thought that I was being carried, and behold, I was walking. Ransom asked what she meant. What you have made me see, answered the lady, is as plain as the sky, but I never saw it before. Yet it has happened every day. One goes into the forest to pick the best food, and already the thought of one fruit rather than another has grown up in one's mind. Then, it may be, one finds a different fruit, and not the fruit one thought of. One joy expected, and another is given. But this I had never noticed before, that the very moment of the finding there is in the mind a kind of thrusting back or setting aside. The picture of the fruit you have not found is still for a moment before you, and if you wished, if it were possible to wish, you could keep it there. You could send your soul after the good you had expected instead of turning to the good you had got. You could refuse the real good. You could make the fruit taste insipid by thinking of the other. That doesn't actually get at that point as clearly as I was thinking it did. But the whole idea too is this is what she's wrestling with what it means to accept the will of God in your life without and recognize that as good without wishing that it were otherwise.
Right. Yeah, well, and it goes back to that point that you were, point that you were making earlier of the good that Perelandra experiences is different than the good that Earth is going to experience, and so there's, like, we get to experience this tiny little piece of God's goodness, and God's God, who knows what other goodness he's working in the universe, maybe that's kind of like one of the big picture, like, ideas of this, that obviously the story of Christ and his redemption of earth is huge, it's huge for us, but God is God, and so the goodness that he can be working in the universe is unlimited. There's no cap on that. So it's a helpful thing maybe for that theodicy problem. Like, why did God allow sin to come to this world? Why did he allow that to happen? Why does he allow suffering? Like, I don't know. You don't know. We're just little pieces, and God's goodness is so much bigger than us.
And that relates to the tension in that book related to the test that God has given them, the test of not being on the island overnight, right? So they're living in this this land of
Right.
these
It's
moving,
like undulating.
yes, which,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't plan. You
Mhm.
can't know where
Mhm.
you'll be in this moment
Right.
or that.
Right.
You have to just trust
Mhm.
that it will be good,
Mhm.
and they don't. They can't sleep on the fixed island.
Mhm.
That would be wrong, because it would
Right.
be them wanting to plan instead
Mhm.
of trust God.
Right, and have that control of being able to plan where they're going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then he doesn't want to say that that's utterly wrong either,
Mhm.
because in the end they end up being not on that land but
Mhm.
another land. There is a
Mhm.
fixed element,
Right,
there is
right.
that planning, but they have to go through this experience first of trusting that God's plan
Right.
is ultimately good
Right.
in this little way.
Right. Well, because ultimately order and plan is good, right? It's not. You don't want chaos. That's
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah.
Order is good.
Yeah.
And so to desire to be able to plan isn't like a bad desire, but if it's not God's will at that time, then like you have to give it up.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
recognizing there's that deeper order that we
Mhm.
can't see,
Mhm.
that is
Mhm.
actually ordered in God's mind,
Right.
in God's plan.
Right. Yeah.
And that, in the moment I'm on this floating island
Right.
without able to control what happens, but it all is part of this greater plan
Yeah.
that God is doing.
Yeah, and that hadn't occurred to me. But going back to the issue of why is there sin and why is there suffering, it's like we're capable of imagining, like, what if the fall never happened? What if God didn't allow that to happen? That would have been good. That would have been a good, you know.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, it would have been, but it's not the good that God has for us. So
Yeah.
get over it. Like, experience your good that God has for us.
Yeah.
You know?
Don't let the memory
Yeah.
of that
be
in you, like that fruit.
Right.
Oh, I wanted
Right.
this fruit, but I got this one.
Yeah.
And I love the way she's describing, Lewis is describing through her, that experience of what it's like to, in that moment, realize I could hold on to what I wanted, or I could take this.
Yeah.
And
Right.
you could if you wanted to.
Yeah.
It's also interesting. One of the things that always perplexed me, it's a difficult issue in theology, is how was it that Eve and Adam were able to fall? Like, how were they created as perfect but fallible?
Right.
And I think that the best explanation I've ever read is really just right here. Like, okay, I don't understand how that could be, but yet now with trusting and following Lewis's sanctified imagination, I could imagine this situation where the person is good and true, but not in a way that not a solid way, right?
Right.
You could be riding on a bike and there's no reason to fall, but you could.
You could still, you can be walking along the edge of a precipice, and not fall, or you could fall,
Right.
You're,
There's nothing that will make you.
Right.
But it's possible.
It's possible, yeah.
Well, this is fun. One more thing. And this is what he says about gender here, which he gets into that a lot in that hideous trap. And he works it out here more in prose form, even though it's a story.
Yeah.
He works it out more narratively in that hideous strength. But here, what he says is so interesting. When he talks about the bodies, so even though the Venus and Mars, Perelandra and Malcandra, are angelic, Eldil, they're still male and female. Or actually, not male and female. They're feminine and masculine. So he says this: the bodies were both naked. They were both. This is talking about the Eldil, and both free from any sexual characteristic, either primary or secondary, that one would have expected. But whence came this curious difference between them? He found that he could point to no single feature wherein the difference resided, yet it wasn't possible to ignore. One could try. Ransom has tried 100 times to put it into words. He has said that Malacandra was like rhyme and Perelandra like melody. He has said that Malacandra affected him like a quantitative, Perelandra like an accentual meter. He thinks that the first held out in his hand something like a spear, but the hands of the other were open with the palms toward him. But I don't know that any of these attempts has helped much. All the events, what Ransom saw at that moment, was the real meaning of gender, Everyone must sometimes have wondered why in nearly every tongue certain inanimate objects are masculine and others are feminine. What is masculine about a mountain or feminine about a certain tree? Ransom has cured me of believing that this is purely morphological phenomena, depending on the form of the word. Still, less is gender an imaginative extension of sex. Our ancestors did not make mountains masculine because they projected male characteristics into them. The real process is the reverse. Gender is a reality, and a more fundamental reality than sex. Sex is, in fact, merely an adaptation to organic life of a fundamental polarity which divides all created beings. Female sex is simply one of the things that have feminine gender. There are many others, and masculine and feminine meet us on planes of reality where male and female would be simply meaningless. Masculine is not attenuated male, nor feminine attenuated female. On the contrary, the male and female of organic creatures are rather faint and blurred reflections of masculine and feminine. Their reproductive functions, their differences in strength and size, partly exhibit, but partly also confuse and misrepresent the real polarity. All this Ransom saw, as it were, with his own eyes. The two white creatures were sexless, but he of Malacandra was masculine, not male. She of Perelandra was feminine, not female. So, the real meaning of gender.
Mm-hmm. It's a really insightful perspective. Like, when was this? The 60s when he published these? 50s, something like that. I don't know. Just in 2019, in such like we live in such a gender confused era. I think his perspective that gender is something that is really firmly rooted in the really real is really, really helpful. That your gender is something that is, it's not your gender, it is gender, it's inherent to reality. It's not something that's fluid or that changes, or it's so deeply rooted, and that our bodies are just what did he say, that's like an adaptation to that.
Yes, a reflection that
reality,
partly reveals and partly obscures the real reality.
Yeah.
Above and beyond it all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In any approach, well, one of the things we've said in class is that the thing about humanity is that if you want to understand humanity, you can't start with humanity. Mm-hmm. I mean, the whole idea that we're made in the image of God means that if you want to understand who we are, you have to start by looking at God. Yeah. Now, obviously, God is not gendered, but God is, we're part of this creation, and he's saying whether or not it's exactly like he's talking about.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
there's still this idea that gender is bigger than than if we're a man or a woman. It's this thing that we participate in that's above us, and it can't be reduced to roles or biology. Right. Nor is it something that we construct. Right. So it's this greater reality that's being played out in this cosmic plan that we participate in, and then to participate joyfully in however God has installed us to be. Right.
Yeah. And I think he's right that there's a lot of potential for that to become very fuzzy when our physical bodies, when we start wanting to change things, control things, I mean, it just,
which gets very much into your second book, or in the third book, in the That Needed Strength. That's where
like trying to control humanity and make it what you want it to be, that's the whole NICE's goal, right?
Well, hopefully we've encouraged the students about this book, and maybe piqued their interest to read the third one if they haven't already done it for your class. So, great. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Sure.